Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Voices for Nature podcast. My name's Chris Gambian.
And I'm Jackie Mumford.
There are few landscapes in Australia more iconic than the Snowy Mountains, one of the hottest, driest continents on Earth, but yet more snow than Switzerland, they used to say. According to the legend, the home of competitive skiing, but at any rate, home to one of the most extraordinary and diverse landscapes in the world. So that special place is now under threat, and tonight we're going to talk about why and what we can do about it.
Yes, and we're very excited to be joined by some wonderful guests this evening. We've got Gary Dunnett, who is the Executive Officer at the National Parks Association of New South Wales, a member group of Nature Conservation Council. So it's great to have Gary here. NPA has been an established conservation organisation for 60 years and runs citizen science and community engagement programs, and also Australia's largest bushwalking program. So it's great to have you here, Gary. We've also got Deirdre. Deirdre has over 25 years experience in community education about the Australian Alps National Parks and has worked in the National Parks Service and served on National Parks Advisory Committees and alpine advisory committees in Australia. So great to have Deirdre here. And finally, we have Bob Debus. And some of you might remember Bob Debus as the New South Wales Environment Minister from 1999. And Bob has had a really large impact on the environment in New South Wales. During his time in the role, Bob expanded the National Park estate by 1.8 million hectares, which is amazing. So great to have you here, Bob. And Bob is also president of the Colong Foundation for Wilderness, another NCC member group. So great to have all our three panelists here tonight. Welcome. Before we get in,
go on. Sorry,
I was going to say, before we get into the questions from our panel, I just wanted to remind people that because we are live this evening, whether you're joining us on Zoom or if you're following us on Facebook at the moment, please jump in the comments. You can talk to other people watching the podcast this evening, or you can send questions to us as hosts. And if we have time, we'll try and answer some questions from the crowd this evening.
Deirdre, we thought we might start with you. Can you paint us a picture? So not everybody who's listening tonight will have been to Snowy Mountains or to Kosciuszko National Park. We've got people listening in from London and the United States. Tell us a bit about the place. What is it? Why is it special?
Well, I think if you compare it with other mountain ranges in the world, the Andes or the Alps in Europe or the Himalayas, they might appear to, at the first sight, to be a rather unexciting sort of place. They're rather low and rounded. And of course, they don't have those dramatic rocky peaks and so on of those other places. But in Australia, they're an incredibly small proportion of the whole of Australia. And that gives them particular importance because having mountainous areas at all is so important for the way that we all live, in particular their value for generating water, for water catchment to be available all the year as the source of the rivers that feed Australia, southeastern Australia. So the fact that they're the source of the rivers on a hot, flat, dry continent means that they shaped the way that we live. And of course, the fact that they're low also means that if you think about looking at a picture of the Annapurnas or Everest, no one's going to graze cattle on the top of those mountains. But we can ski, we can walk, we can graze cattle, we can have engineering schemes right to the summit of our low but important mountain range, highest mountain range. So therefore, the competition for use has been intense throughout the European use of the Australian Alps in general, and Kosciuszko in particular, that being the highest area. How do I go? Would you like me to say some more? I can go on.
Beautiful.
One interesting thing to me is if you think about, if you were to place the Australian Alps running in a line roughly from Alice Springs to Adelaide, just say the geology had determined that instead of where they are along the eastern seaboard, how much differently would we live in Australia?
Yeah, it's amazing having this mountain range, accessible to a lot of people, across New South Wales. And Gary, a question for you. It's Kosciuszko's been in the news a little bit. We're hearing about changes to the plans of management. Why is this an important moment? And can you tell us a bit about that process and what's going on?
Sure. Look, Jackie, I really wish that I could say that the current plans for Kosciuszko, in terms of the master plan that's been produced and the amendment to the plan of management, was the only issue that we were all confronting in this landscape. But that's far from the truth. We get a lot of language about Kosciuszko as a pristine wilderness. The reality is, firstly, that it's a landscape that's in recovery, and it's a landscape that was in recovery from well over a century of clearing, grazing, mining. Our largest infrastructure project in the country in terms of the creation of the Snowy Mountain schemes. And so all of those historic impacts are still in the process of getting back to the point where you've got that environmental resilience. But that's really been the piece of work of national parks and the community over the last half century or so, to bring back that sort of vigor to that landscape by putting in place really strong environmental protection programs. Threatened species programs, landscape restoration programs, water restoration programs, really trying to get the ecosystem humming again. What we've seen over the last several years, though, is incredibly disturbing. Let's just pick up on a couple of the low points. First, we had the Deputy Premier's Kosciuszko Wild Horse Heritage Bill, which, irrespective of how you feel about feral horses, the reality is it's a massive distortion in the day-to-day management of that park, because it's basically saying there is a single feral species which its welfare is going to drive the way you manage that entire park. We're not aware of any precedent across the planet where anyone has put in place such an instrument into a protected area. It's extraordinary. But that's not the only thing over the last few years. We've also had the Snowy Hydro Corporation reinstate their program of active construction through the Snowy 2 project. And so as a consequence of that, we've already lost literally hundreds of hectares of native vegetation that's been cleared across the Kosciuszko National Park. We've had impacts on water tables. We'll continue to see the movement of invasive species through this landscape as a result of another major engineering intervention into Kosciuszko. Most recently, we've got a proposal to put overhead transmission lines for the first time in 50 years in a New South Wales national park. The current plan of management for Kosciuszko says they have to go underground, and yet we've got a plan of management amendment in the works which actually says, yes, they have to go underground, but for Snowy 2. So the only time that principle's been tested in half a century, this government said, no, we'll go back to the old technology and we'll just build transmission lines across the park. So that's 8 kilometres cleared for 200 metres along that corridor. It's an extraordinary thing. So we've got this groundswell of assaults on Kosciuszko, which are degrading the park, which are reducing its resilience. And then what we have in the public arena is this extraordinary set of plans that really turn on its head the environmental management framework for the entire park. It's not just one thing, it's a master plan. It's precinct plans for 2 of the most notable historic heritage sites within the park, Kuranga and Urangabilly. It's an amendment to the plan of management, and it's 30 technical plans. So just get your mind around what's actually gone into the public arena and the expectation that the community is dredging their way through that. But when we do dredge our way through it, what we find is that decades of careful balance between the conservation attributes of the site, all those programs to try and restore Kosciuszko to its former splendour, and the very legitimate aspirations of people to recreate in that landscape, that careful balance is actually being thrown away. And what we have is a series of plans that simply say that there is a demand expected in the future for more people to be able to go to Kosciuszko. Therefore, we have to make the park accommodated. So that fundamental idea of conservation management, that you start from the intrinsic values of a landscape, you understand what their needs and potential threats and vulnerabilities are, and then you decide what interventions it can cope with and what visitation it can cope with, has been turned on its head. And instead, we've got a series of plans that say, we reckon there's a commercial opportunity to be gained in Kosciuszko through increasing the amount of accommodation by 60%. So that's fine. We'll make the park fit it. It's a really, it is the end of an incredibly disruptive period for Kosciuszko. And look, I don't want to dig too far down into what the reasons for it are, but the thing that concerns MPA certainly more than anything else about this is not just the damage that's going to be wrought on Kosciuszko, but it's the message it gives us that our incredible, precious idea of a national park, a gift that our community makes to future generations in perpetuity, is being eroded to this view that it is, our national parks are simply assets to be exploited. They're places whose potential and final purpose is still to be determined. So in other words, they're just another greenfield development site. They're not. When Parliament makes a decision to gazette a place as a national park, they're saying it's there for conservation first and foremost. And we are watching the erosion of that principle. And it's a matter of incredible concern that this is being played out in such a precious landscape as Kosciuszko National Park.
Thanks, Gary. Bob, when you were Environment Minister, you added more hectares to the National Park estate than I think perhaps any other Environment Minister in history. And you were the Minister who made this current plan of management. Can you tell us what sort of an approach do you think ought to be taken when it comes to an area of the sort of conservation values as Kosciuszko?
Thank you, Chris. The 2006 plan of management, it's been amended several times lately, was the consequence of an enormous amount of work by National Park staff and contracted scientists with consultation involving every stakeholder group that it was possible to think about. And it's astonishing to remember that in 2006, there was just beginning to be a much wider debate about climate change. Climate change was, even a couple of years before that, very much a minor issue in most conversations about conservation. However, this particular plan of management did think about climate change. It did make pretty accurate assumptions about what was going to happen over the 30 years or so after 2006. And I'm just looking at a summary of its concerns, the plan's concerns about recreational use. It says, managing recreational activities or sites within predetermined impact limits, changing the management of some recreational activities so as to protect significant natural and cultural values, controlling environmental impacts by introducing permit systems for some recreational uses, capping bed numbers in resorts at existing levels, and investigating other means of measuring environmental carrying capacity, prohibiting the use of campfires in some areas to protect park values. So what we had there was an orientation which said this is an extremely valuable place and we must preserve it, even though we know people love to do recreation there. And as Gary has said, those kinds of assumptions have now been turned upon their head. What's more, the special activation area proposed for the area inside the park that is set aside for accommodation and resorts at the moment, That plan was introduced with virtually no consultation with the Park Service or conservationists. The so-called Snowy 2 pumped hydro scheme, which Gary has mentioned, was introduced without any serious examination of its environmental impacts, with a kind of assumption that it wouldn't do much harm. And that scheme is now objected. It's worth looking. I hope Gary can find ways to show people his open letters to the state government. The criticism of that scheme is now supported by the most extraordinary range of engineers and former public servants. Gary's assembled a group of people who used to just about run the state of New South Wales 20 years ago, and they're all saying that this Snowy 2 project, huge pumped hydro project, won't work properly, and they are also saying it's incredibly destructive to be breaking the rules of my old plan and building high tension towers across the landscape. On top of all that, the assumptions about climate change that were being made back in 2006 have come to fruition, unfortunately, and there are tremendous problems of particularly of dieback amongst snow gums that I'm aware of, which is changing sections of the park. Back in 2006, there were a couple of thousand wild horses. I use that term because there are people who apparently are further afield than New South Wales listening. Brumbies, perhaps a tenth of what there is there now, and the introduction of the legislation that Gary has mentioned, which allows the national parks' own legislation to be subverted, in effect, by a group of advisors who know nothing about the administration of parks and have some kind of lay knowledge about what they think is the heritage value of horses. All of this adds up to an extraordinary assault on values that we regarded as recently as 2006, but really even later than that, as being immutable, as being the kinds of things that you supported to ensure that the national park remained protected and sacrosanct forever. And my last observation is that these changes, these ruthless changes, are occurring at exactly the moment when we need more than ever to preserve and conserve our natural landscapes.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. I think that's such an important point. The sort of, Gary said that we're already in a sort of recovery stage in the national park, and the importance that, the point you're making there about the importance of conserving the national park and protecting it and allowing it to regenerate. One of the things that we, often talk about at the Nature Conservation Council is how we get more people to appreciate the beauty of nature and appreciate the wonder of nature. And one of the ways that, that we can do that is through tourism and having people access these beautiful areas like Kosciuszko. Just keen to hear from you on, how do we, I suppose, promote tourism in a way that is sustainable and allows people to appreciate the natural beauty of Kosciuszko? And keen particularly to hear from you on this, Deirdre and Gary.
Okay. I used to work in the National Park Service in Victoria as in the Interpretation Community Education branch, and I spent the rest of my life as a teacher. And my answer to everything in managing parks was always educate the community so that they understand the Australian landscape and the special qualities that they are privileged to have access to here, but also the special obligations they've got to look after those places, to understand how they work. But unfortunately, in the last 30 years, there's been a decline in the responsibility taken by government and by park services in particular, through lack of funding and so on, to offer interpretation or community education. And most people going to these places will walk around, look at the shopping mall, because they don't really have a handle on what they can actually understand about it, what they can learn about it, because there isn't sufficient investment in educating them. If I was running Kosciuszko, I would make it practically obligatory for everybody who went there to have a course, even a 5-minute course, in how important and special that place is.
And it's often, you get so much more out of these places when you learn about it. Whenever I've sort of been traveling, you always want to, go and read the information board and find out more about these beautiful places. Yeah. Gary, what is the sort of dream scenario for you to sort of strike that balance?
Look, there's no question that environmental education is incredibly important. We need to sort of understand the vulnerabilities and the strengths and what's special about these places. I've got to say, though, that one of the reasons why MPA runs the largest bushwalking club in the country is that it's more than the intellectual process. There's a question there of connection, and that connection, that caring really comes from the opportunity to experience these places. So there is no way that what we're trying to say is that we should be stopping people from going to Kosciuszko National Park and have those extraordinary experiences. But let's be sensible about how we do it. There's a handful of parts of the master plan that has been put on exhibition that are actually quite laudable. And those bits relate to how do you provide a broader range of experiences over the summer months. The really disappointing thing, though, is that these documents are not actually aimed at improving access to special places, special experiences over the summer months where, let's face it, you go to somewhere like Perisher in summer and it is a ghost town. There's an extraordinary surplus of unused stranded assets there for 9 months out of the year. But it's really clear that the agenda here is actually all about increasing accommodation and commercial returns over that peak winter period. And that's the time of the year where Kosciuszko is most under stress, because the basic services, whether they're sewage treatment plants or the consumption of fresh water or all the waste management, just can't cope with the footprint we exert on that landscape over the winter period. So we've got a planning arrangement which is trying to increase pressure at precisely the part of the seasonal cycle that the park can't cope with it, rather than actually doing the sensible thing, which is to actually let our feet tread much more softly across this landscape by encouraging more people to experience this extraordinary place during the summer period.
Yeah.
So somebody has just been asking Gary on the questions. Let's really hone it down, and I think it's important to probably make the distinction between the Special Activation Precinct, which covers the whole of the Snow Mountains region, not just the National Park, and the amendments that are being proposed to the Plan of Management for Kosciuszko. Is it right to say that the Plan of Management would see the bed numbers inside the park really increase from 10,000 to 14,000 as a consequence of the changes that are being proposed?
Chris, it's actually even worse than that. So within the resorts, the bed numbers would increase from about 10,500 to over 14,000. But if you add in what they've referred to as their tourism opportunity areas, it's more like nearly 11,000 to well over 15,000. So, it's more than a 40% increase on the theoretical bed limit, but in fact, what's been occupied at the moment significantly less than that. So they're talking about more like a 60% increase.
Just for folks who don't know what the bed limit is and what that means, can you just unpack that a bit? Can you just explain what does the bed limit in the park mean?
Sure. Look, in Australia, there's very few, vanishingly small cases where we actually manage the carrying capacity of the protected area network. Kosciuszko is an exception, and it's an exception because each person who goes, and particularly each person who stays overnight, there's all the normal human functions that happen in any 24-hour cycle. And because this isn't a municipal area, you can't connect Kosciuszko, any of the resorts, to the municipal STP down at Jindabyne, you have to be able to provide all those services up in the alpine zone. And that's incredibly difficult, and it's limited, and it has its significant environmental impacts because it's almost impossible not to have periodic exceedances in that really challenging area. And so what has historically been done for Kosciuszko is they've used bed numbers as an analogue for overall carrying capacity, and it's been a really effective device to date. Of course, individual resorts, individual operators, chalets have bridled against various limitations associated with that, but it's been a tool that's actually been fit for purpose. If we ask ourselves that instead of the objective just being to increase the commercial gains out of the resorts and other accommodation providers, but what we're actually trying to do is to provide more opportunities for people to see and enjoy Kosciuszko, wouldn't it actually be more of a win-win to build your accommodation off-park, where individual private operators get all of the benefits of running that Airbnb or traditional B&B or accommodation in the local community, rather than it actually being these big operators who've got a stranglehold on the national park at the moment? For me, that's a win-win. It's economic prosperity, it's economic advantage in a place that can cope with it from an environmental point of view, and people can get to the park during the day. They can have those fantastic experiences, but they can do it as a day visitor, they can do it as a walker, they can do it as a skier. They don't need to do it as additional overnight stays.
Could I add one point there to what Gary said?
Yeah, please.
Ever since Neville Gare, the first superintendent, was appointed to the park in 1959, when there were 300 beds between Jindabyne and the top of Kosciuszko, there's been a policy developed through the visionary people and knowledgeable people who've managed the park to try to discourage urbanisation of the park for the reasons that Gary pointed out. And consequently, this draft amendment to the management plan, which says quite blatantly on the first page, our objective is to remove the policy of non-urbanisation of the park, to encourage further urbanisation of the park, in other words. That's the whole reason for amending the management plan, quite clear and straightforward and upfront. So that 50 or 60 year policy is being cast aside with virtually no public consultation, except for this rushed period of 3 or 4 weeks of these incredibly complicated documents. And no one really, except for you good people who are listening, I hope, really understand what's being done in your name.
Yeah. This is a question. I'm going to go. I was going to throw you a question, Bob. Go for it.
I'm sorry. It's just to say, so much of what is going on has this quality that Deirdre has mentioned, just simply overturning, denying 50 years of policy direction and assumption, almost without consultation. It's so about the Brumby legislation. The Brumbies are a very hard issue, as I more than most know, but the extraordinary, unprecedented Brumby legislation is introduced without any broad consultation at all. The new hydroelectricity enterprises are also so introduced. The activation zones are introduced are announced effectively, as Deirdre has just suggested, without consultation. Now there's a bit of consultation later, but it's after the event. And each of those things that I've mentioned overturns a trajectory of policy that has been ingrained in the administration of national parks for the previous 50 odd years.
That's well said, Bob. Matt Keane, Atticus Fleming, both people who who've been friends to the conservation movement. Clearly, people who care about nature in New South Wales. In fact, Minister Keane, I don't know if you know this, but once famously said he would like to be an Environment Minister in the model of Bob Debus.
Yes.
What's your advice to the government, to Minister Keane, to Atticus at the moment? What should be happening next? I'll ask Bob and I'll ask you all.
Okay, well, look, I won't presume, obviously, Chris, to make direct suggestions to them, but I will acknowledge that Minister Keane is really good at in so many respects, and that Atticus Fleming is a well-known and prominent environmentalist, conservationist who's worked in contexts other than government. In fact, they are both so sympathetic, as it were, that one's got to search further to explain what on earth has been going on around them. And what's been going on around them is mostly something called the National Party. It's that in a coalition government of this sort, for most purposes, policy outside the metropolitan area is ceded to the National Party, and the National Party is pro-development. It is generally, or not entirely, but generally, extremely hostile to the conservation ethic, and it has been quite unconcerned about these changes that we have been describing. In fact, it has mostly driven them.
Thanks,
so
Bob.
I can't say I won't say what the minister and the head of national parks should do, but I will say that everyone around this screen should be trying to help them as much as possible.
Yeah, and that was kind of, one of the questions that's coming through a little bit on the chat. And another question we had is for people, watching who are concerned about overdevelopment and, continued degradation in the park, what can we be doing? And in the chat there, you'll also see some links to the submission guide on the NPA website and to both the Colong Foundation and the National Parks Association websites for people who are interested. But yeah, what are the sort of main things that you'd like to see people doing at the moment? Perhaps Gary and then the others.
I think we need to take the opportunity to use the formal processes here, which means putting a submission on the master plan and the plan of management in particular. I think on the chat, we've actually got the details for going to the NPA website to see our submission guide. One thing I really need to emphasise to people is that there's been a number of changes in the way that government processes submissions, to the extent that there's explicit statements that they'll treat things that look as though they're coming in as a template, just as a single submission rather than as individual submissions. So it's really, really important to make your comments in your own words. So that formal process is good for giving texture and detail to what we want. But I think we need to go beyond that in this case. And a really useful starting point is to be contacting your individual local MP, particularly your state MPs, and letting you know that you are really distressed about what is happening in our national parks in New South Wales, and that Kosciuszko exemplifies that concern. Whenever we speak to the Minister for Environment, we're told that it's a government that listens very strongly to what local MPs say. And so it's really up to us to make sure that all those local members understand that what's happening at the moment is not acceptable. It's the thin end of the wedge, and we're not going to put up with such a precious concept as the national park being pulled apart in a single term of office. This has been such a bipartisan concept. It's been something that successive parliaments have held as a core principle, a core concept that we all buy into, and it's fraying away at the moment. You need to be talking to your local MP so that when Minister Keane asks the question of his colleagues, is this a good or a bad thing? They absolutely are saying, my local members think this one's a stinker.
Yeah.
Deirdre, your thoughts?
Well, I already wrote my letter to Minister Keane, and in a roundabout way, I pointed out to him that he's standing on the shoulders of giants, and that history will remember him poorly if he allows this to go on his watch. And of course, it already happened to his predecessor, Gabriel Upton, who allowed the feral horse legislation to be shoved in over her. And I hope that Matt Keane will have a bit more gumption, a bit more guts, and a bit more knowledge of his own culture's history, because he's following the footsteps of William McKell, of Tom Lewis, of and of Bob Debus, I'm happy to say, some great people who had vision and did things because they should be done, not because it was politically expedient to do so.
Thanks, Deirdre. And anyone who is thinking they might want to get in touch with their local member, if you go back to our history of episodes, back when we called this podcast Cocktails, Controversy and Conservation, we interviewed a couple of local MPs who gave us some tips on how to approach your local MP and how to be heard in the process. So you'll be able to find that on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and deep on the Nature Conservation Council website. Unfortunately, that's all the time we've got for tonight. Thank you so much to you all. We could probably keep talking about this for the rest of the evening, but thank you so much for your time. Thank you to everybody who's joined us online. We've had well over 200 people here in the Zoom room, and many hundreds more will catch up afterwards on Facebook and the NCC website. Please, if you can, we've put in the chat a link to donate some money to the National Parks Association and to the Colong Foundation, two organisations that are affiliated with the Nature Conservation Council. Remember, this work can only happen because there are people who can make it happen, and your small donations or your large donations do actually go a very long way in making some big improvements for nature and for conservation around the state. So thank you to everybody who already chips in, and if you can spare a few bucks, it certainly makes a big difference. Thanks to all of our guests, and have a good rest of your evening.
Thanks all.
Thanks all.
Bye. Bye.
Thanks, Bob. Thanks, Gary. Thanks, Deirdre.
Thank you.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, can you chip in to help us be the voice for nature? We rely on donations to keep being effective, loud and independent. Visit nature.org.au.